This is my new giant shield mantis. Well, it's not giant yet, but it'll get there. I got this little guy yesterday along with two other species of mantis, and today I'll be setting up its vivarium. This guy may be small now, but he can grow up to 4 inches long, so a 10-gallon tank will be perfect. I converted this 10-gallon into a front opening enclosure with a DIY background back when I got my first ghost mantis. To start, we need to make a false bottom, and for that I have Leica. I poured a layer into the enclosure that's about an inch thick. Leica is the perfect option for a false bottom like this as it's light and absorbs water, not to mention it's fairly cheap. With the Leica in place, I now need to make a barrier between the false bottom and the substrate using an old piece of mesh. I situated it into the enclosure, making sure that the edges were folded up. With the mesh in place, I can add the substrate. I'll be using my typical ABG mix made of 1 part cocoa fiber, 1 part sand, 1 part reptile bark, and 2 parts sphagnum moss. It was a little bit dry though, as this was an old batch, so I added some water and mixed it up. I then added it to the enclosure. In total, I added a layer that is about 2 inches thick in the front and 3 in the back. Whenever I add substrate like this, I always slope it up towards the back to create depth. Anyways, with the substrate in place, it's time for the hardscape. For that, I'll use an old piece of spiderwood with some air plants attached to it. As with most things in this project, this was also from the previous vivariums. As you probably imagine, the hardscape wasn't that difficult to figure out for this one, mostly just a repeat of what I did last time. Still, I think it looks great. The air plants really add a lot. It's nothing special, but I like to keep it simple when it comes to mantids. Anyway, now that the hardscape's done, it's time for my favorite part, the plants. I got a whole variety for all 3 mantis enclosures, but I'll only be using these 5 for the shield mantis. Like usual, I start prepping the plants by removing the pot and breaking up the roots from the soil. I repeat this process with each plant, making sure to get off as much soil as I can. Most of these plants are ones that I've used with mantises in the past and I've had pretty good luck with. Some of them are new though, so we'll see how it goes. I ended up switching out the fern with this plant as I felt it fit with the rest of the plants better. After removing as much soil as I could from the roots of the plants, I took them outside and sprayed them down to remove any excess soil. With the plants fully cleaned and prepped, I can finally start planting. To start off, I put this umbrella plant in the back right of the enclosure. Whenever I plant an enclosure, I usually work from biggest to smallest with the plants, but for this specific one I had to work from back to front, which funnily enough ended up being biggest to smallest. I'm really glad I ended up switching out that fern. Don't get me wrong, I love ferns, but I just think this plant fits the enclosure a lot better. I placed it to the left of the spiderwood. I then added this waffle plant to the front right of the enclosure. I've never really had good luck with these, but I've also never used it in a setup like this before, so I figured I'd experiment a little bit. I then placed this dragon's tongue near the front of the enclosure. To finish things off, I added the ivy to the right in between the wood and the glass. It was a bit of a tight fit, so I had to use tweezers to get it in. Of course, no vivarium is complete without leaf litter. I sprinkled it over the soil in the enclosure to create a forest floor effect. I absolutely love the way leaf litter looks in any vivarium. For me, it's one of those things that brings the look full circle. Whether it's a tiny terrarium or a giant vivarium, you can never go wrong with leaf litter. Anyways, to further enhance that forest floor feel, I'll add some botanicals. As much as I love leaf litter, botanicals are what brings everything together. As I'm sure you've probably noticed, I've been using them quite a bit lately. With the botanicals added to finish things off, I misted down the tank. I then introduced the mantis to its new home. Even though it's very simple and straightforward, I still think this vivarium looks beautiful. I do wish there was a little more height to the plants in the back, but they'll eventually grow and fill in the space. As most of you know, I recently lost my female ghost mantis, Phantom, and I absolutely loved having her. I also loved setting up her enclosure. At the time, I had planned to get 3 mantises, but I was never able to find them. After she passed, I knew I had to get more, so I ended up with this guy. It doesn't end here though, I've got at least 2 more coming. Stay tuned for that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.